Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
John, thank you. Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity to come out and talk with all of you. I see a few familiar faces out there in addition to Gary. When you're the president of an organization, you actually have, I have 58 bosses, including Gary. We have a fairly large board. Also good to see Representative Mentzer here. Hate to say it's better to see you in Lancaster than Harrisburg, given some of the stuff that goes on in our wonderful capital, but we'll see how all of that works out. I really do appreciate the opportunity to come out. I really do. This is a little different. I mean, I've done a lot of Rotary, some of them on the book. A lot of the times it's talking about politics, so it's a nice discussion, a nice change to switch from 2017 politics to 1870 politics, which we'll talk a little bit about here today. Interestingly, the music choice, which I have to kind of comment on, the song Battle Hymn of the Republic, I was sitting here thinking about, as you know, how people changed those, actually had variant forms during the Civil War. The one of them was, many of you know of a guy named John Brown. John Brown, depending on which side of the Mason-Dixon line you fall, was either a tremendous martyr or a crazed individual if you're in the South. Having lived in the South, just like your president, I lived in the South for 4 years. I lived in Atlanta, where coming from Philadelphia, had to learn a new language, speaking Southern, of course. But at the beginning of the war, the Northern soldiers would sing to the tune of Battle Hymn of the Republic, "John Brown's body lies a molding in the grave," and they had their own verses for that. And then later in the war, as it got uglier and things got a little more depressing, they changed that to "Hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree" to the same tune, Jeff Davis being the president of the Confederacy. So the song underwent a few variations over time. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the book that I wrote. Now, I appreciate John's comments about being an historian. I still kind of call myself a student of the war. You'd have a lot of nuns, priests, brothers, and lay teachers who would shudder if they think of me as an historian, but I still count myself as a student. I've been engaged in it, got involved in, gone to Gettysburg at 11 years old and have been interested ever since, and have just become fascinated by American history generally, and particularly this period when, over a period of 4 years, we saw almost between 650 and 700,000 Americans killed. Most of them actually by diseases in camps, but still we slaughtered each other for a period of 4 years. It's, when you think about that, and one of the important things about studying history is to learn the lessons that we should not forget, and that's clearly one of them. But I had this book, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about kind of the genesis of the book. Now, Civil War captain and his lady, love, courtship, and combat from Fort Donelson through the Vicksburg campaign. Now, they told me I can walk around a little, because are we good with that? Or we need that one? I'll just stand there. This doesn't work? Oh, but so that'll still work then. Okay? Okay, good. Well, I'll stand back here. I don't want to mess up your recording or anything. So, Civil War captain's lady, love, courtship, and combat from Fort Donelson through the Vicksburg campaign. Now, the basic structure of the letters is a communication series, more than about 75 letters between an Irish immigrant, Captain Civil War, 17th Illinois Infantry during the Civil War. His name was Josiah Moore, 27 years old. And a woman he met in camp in Peoria named Jenny Lindsay, 19 years old. So 8-year age difference. So these are 75 letters between the two. And because they were both unmarried, these 75 letters functioned largely as a Civil War courtship. It was a romance told through correspondence. And correspondence, if you read the book, and I do have some books afterwards for those who are interested, was extremely important during the 1860s period. It's how people not only communicated, well-written letters were how people showed, believe it or not, their worth. And I did a lot of research in terms of that. Now, I know this is a long title. This was not my choice of the title, I got to tell you. The publisher didn't want to go with my choice. Because it's a Civil War courtship, Civil War love story, my choice was 50 Shades of Blue and Gray. Publisher wasn't too keen on that one, I got to tell you. The other thing that I had to struggle a little bit with, and I know the title popped up, Civil War in the West. Now, the West, for people who don't know, the Western campaigns does not mean California, Oregon, and Washington. Western campaigns largely is everything west of the Pennsylvania border. So during the Civil War, if you read about Gettysburg, and I know many of you have an affinity for Gettysburg and a tie to that battle, when you read about Western troops are Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan from the Union side. Western campaigns were things like Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg. The campaigns to Atlanta were part of the Western campaign that William Tecumseh Sherman did in 1864. So let's clear that up. That's part of what we call the Western theater. Now, part of the problem I had with this is that books about the Civil War are popular, and books particularly about what's called the Eastern theater are much more popular. Books about Lincoln, tremendously popular. A lot of them out, a lot of excellent books written about it. But people want to read, in addition to Lincoln, they want to read about Gettysburg and Antietam and Manassas and Fredericksburg and the Wilderness, which are all Eastern campaign battles that went from 61, 2, 3, 4. So I had a bit of a challenge in that the Western campaign is not quite as popular. So the other thing I pitched to the publisher that he wasn't too keen on either is, what if we just do a man from Illinois who was not Lincoln and who fought at a lot of battles but not Gettysburg. Then I got Lincoln and Gettysburg in the title, and it's like a surefire hit. Well, he wasn't too keen on that one either, but I think he's right. People would have been very upset with both of those options. So there we go. Let's picture the cover. Obviously, Josiah Moore and Jenny. Those are the two people. Now, this is Henry. Henry has absolutely nothing to do with the Civil War. But my kid said to me, Dad, you got to put Henry in there, because Henry would come down and lay down in the office where I did all my work. So Henry has nothing to do with the Civil War, and yes, this is shameless pandering to the dog lovers in the audience. There's no question about that. Close-up of Jenny Lindsay. Close-up of Josiah, taken very early in the war. You can see, it's hard to see, but his captain's bar is on there. Now, I always get two questions, no matter what I've done. The book came out a little over a year ago, actually, July of 16. It did take me 16 years to write, yes. I have this job that kept intruding on it the whole time. So it did take me that period of time. It would ebb and flow, and just the whole concept and the whole process of book writing was fascinating, trying to find a publisher, trying to find an agent, rewriting, and all of those things. But no matter where I go, I always get two questions. One of them is, are you going to write another book? And for a long time, I told people what I told my youngest daughter. That is, if I start talking about another book, could you just take that chair and hit me over the head with it? But I actually do think I have another one, so we're working on that one. We'll see how that goes. But the other one that I get all of the time, and I understand why, in fact, I go into pretty good detail in the book, is, where did you get the letters? Because of the 75 letters, I own them all. I have all of them, including post-war letters and some other materials which I'll talk about momentarily. In the year 2000, I had a friend from a previous job, a colleague. I worked for the American Petroleum Institute. I spent 20 years in the oil industry, including 13 with BP. And I was never in the Gulf. I was never did part of that. But started at the refinery outside Philadelphia. But for 7 years, I worked for API in the Pennsylvania office. And the guy in the Florida office called me one day. I think he'd retired at that point. And he had inherited a cabin. And he found these letters, along with other materials, in an unheated cabin on a lake in Wisconsin that he inherited. I believe it's Lake George, Rhinelander, Wisconsin, for any of you who may know the area. And he called me and he said, I had sold some other stuff for him. I'd acted as a go-between for a sale. And he said, hey, I think I got Civil War letters. I said, well, send them over. He knew that I had an interest in this. He said, send them over. I said, send them over. I'll take a look at them and see what we have. He said, would you sell them for me? So I said, all right, let me see what we got first, and then we'll decide where we're going to go with this. So he sent the letters over. I looked at it and kind of quickly realized, without delving into it deeply, largely what it was, which was, these letters between two people. I hadn't fully fleshed it out yet, but knew that it was fairly significant, because the strange thing is there's a lot of letters from soldiers during the Civil War, believe it or not, because soldiers would send them home, the people would treasure them, communication from their loved one at the front, whether it was Virginia or Georgia or Tennessee or wherever it was, and they'd keep them. What was far more difficult to keep, therefore more rare, were letters from home to the soldier. They had no way of keeping them. They'd be out campaigning, they would be in very difficult weather conditions. Some of them, I think, would get rid of them in case they were captured. They don't want people reading these communications from home. So letters from home are actually fairly rare. What's incredibly rare is to have what we have here, which is a Civil War courtship. To have both sides painted here is very rare. And I didn't fully appreciate that until I began the process. But when he sent me the letters, I looked at them and I said, took them to a few dealers, and interestingly, a couple dealers, they wanted to keep them and look at them. I can't do that, they're not mine. And one guy looked at him, he goes, oh, I'll tell you what, I don't want any of the woman's letters. I don't want any of the post-war letters. I'll give you X dollars for every one of the soldier letters. And I thought about it, and I knew what he would do. He would take the best letters, because some of these letters are from the, from the battlefield at Vicksburg, Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, which is Shiloh. I mean, they're very memorable names that leap out at you from American history. And he would sell those for a good sum of money. And a friend of mine who looked at him, he said, you have to buy them. I said, geez, Dan, I mean, my oldest daughter was starting college the next year. I don't want to buy these letters. But I realized if these were sold, that was the end of the story. This story of these two people would never be put together again. So I did that, and I decided to go along and just kind of buy these and see what I had here, because it kind of struck me that it was probably a book, and hopefully something would come of it. So the two people we talked a little bit about, both Josiah and Jenny, 27-year-old Josiah, 19-year-old Jenny Lindsay, both very well-educated people. You'll see from the letters are extremely well-written. Both of them were very religious people. They were both Presbyterian. In fact, after the war, so there's your spoiler alert. Josiah survived the war, first spoiler alert. He became a Presbyterian minister. So they're both very educated, and they talk a lot in their book, in their letters about religion. So it gave me an opportunity to look at what did religion of the time mean to people of the war? How did it influence their views? How did the war influence their views of religion? And so it gave me the ability to look at that as well. Jenny, despite being 19, you read some of these letters and you say, wow, how the heck, this woman is she's not 19 years old. She was the daughter of one of the most prominent citizens in Peoria, a guy named John Lindsay. And to me, John Lindsay represented the political side of it, which was fascinating. John Lindsay was born in McConnellsburg, PA. His father was an 1812 vet. They operated a tavern in McConnellsburg, and I believe the building's still there. Moved to Peoria after his father died. He became an attorney, practiced law in Peoria. He was a member of the Whig Party, for those of you who remember your history, WHIG. The Whigs were the precursor to the Republican Party, and he ran as a Republican for the Illinois State House and was elected to the State House in the late 1850s. Something happened with John Lindsay. John Lindsay left the Republican Party, and to get a little ahead of ourselves, but just because I love the story and I love talking about it, it's a great quote. In 1862, John Lindsay is elected to the Illinois State Senate as a Democrat, and he becomes what's called a peace Democrat, pejoratively called Copperheads. That is, in the North, they were traitors to the country. The peace Democrats were people who wanted to make peace with the South at any cost. To heck with doing away with slavery. If we got to keep slavery, let's just end this war and be done with it. Well, Lindsay was elected as a peace Democrat in '62. The Democrats had significant, you hear all the out party. Well, this 1862 was clearly an out party year. Lincoln was elected in '60. A lot of problems in the war. So John Lindsay and many others are elected not only in state houses across the United States, but in Congress as well. So Lindsay gets on the floor. Lincoln had made his Emancipation Proclamation after the Battle of Antietam and infuriated many who were not in favor of abolition. And Lindsay's comment on the floor of the Illinois State Senate about Abraham Lincoln was this. He said, if all of hell was distilled to liquid fire and poured down his throat, it would be altogether too good for him. So you can see our rancor of today is a little bit incomparable to what was often said during those times. I do have to give the publisher a lot of credit as well, because the publisher made the decision to keep all of these letters intact, because some of them were fairly mundane. Jenny would write to Josiah and say things like, I went to visit my sister today. She lived in Chicago. We went to church today. We were down at the park today. But the reality is that's what soldiers wanted. They wanted that mundane comment. They wanted that normalcy, to know that things back home were as normal as they could be for their people. And for many in the North, which I get into in the book as well, and it's interesting to kind of think about this. It forced me to focus on things that I hadn't really focused on much or not thought much about at all. But to think about the fact that for many people in the North, it was almost as if there was no war going on. Yeah, their loved ones were away, and time to time you had tragic news. But for many in the North, with a couple of exceptions, one of them being in this area in 1862 with the first invasion of the North by Robert E. Lee, which ended at the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg, depending on which side of the Mason-Dixon line you come in from. And then again in 63, when this area, of course, had the invasion of Lee that culminated in the Battle of Gettysburg. For most people in the North, it was, the battle's there, it's tough, it's difficult. In the South, you've got occupying armies in your backyard, quite literally. So there was a fairly major difference, but the people in the service wanted to know that their loved ones were safe. Now, part of what I got, in addition to the letters, were a lot of photographs. A couple of them are going to pop up here in a moment. A lot of photographs of men from the unit. And included in it, the guy would call me who sold me the stuff, call him time to time. I found this picture. Yep, send that over. I'll buy that too. Yep, send that over. I'll buy it. He said he found an old wooden matchbox, and he said, I found a bunch of buttons and numbers in it, and I suspected what it was. And it turns out these were the numbers that were on that hat. You can't quite see it, but those are the letters and numbers. The 17 denotes his regiment, 17th Illinois. The two eagle buttons would have gone on either side of the forage cap. Now, many of you might be familiar with Civil War items. Usually these numbers are like a stamped brass, and they're pretty plain and they're cheap. These appear to be very intricate. In fact, they may be silver. I haven't had tested yet, but again, showing these people were fairly well-to-do. Josiah was a student at the beginning of the war, but still his family was probably fairly well-to-do. This is Josiah's house in Hanover, Illinois. Now, right there, many of you can see, that's Josiah's father. A lot of this came from the family. I was very fortunate to find Josiah's great-grandson still alive. Now, interesting how we met each other. About a year after I bought the material, the guy I bought it from, Bob, called me or sent me an email and said, hey, I'll give you a heads up on something. A guy named David Jupe called me. David is Josiah and Jenny, so another spoiler alert, they survived the war and they got married, okay, so that one's out there too, no suspense. David is their great-grandson. He called me the other day, and David called Bob. He said, hey, Bob, it's great. I heard you inherited the cabin. That was wonderful. We had such great times as kids going to that cabin on the lake. He said, hey, there were some Civil War letters in there. I'd really like to get them. Well, David wasn't real happy, as I wouldn't be either, because I even said to Bob when he sold them, Bob, these are tremendous. I mean, why don't you want to keep these? He said, well, it's his aunt's husband's family, no blood relation, doesn't have a huge interest in the Civil War or history generally, but David certainly did. David wasn't happy when he found out that his family's letters were in the hands of a non-family person living in Pennsylvania. So we contacted each other after a time, and he turned out to be incredibly helpful to me because he had done a lot of family research. So he had a lot of these, or was able to help me with some of these pictures. This one did come with the collection, but so Josiah's father's there. You can't quite see it. You have to put it under a glass, but his mother is tucked back in there. Now, I'm told the house is still there. When I visited Illinois on 2 different occasions, trying to go see the house, I kept calling the phone number that was at this address because the address is still there. Could never get him to answer the phone. So I don't know whether they thought I was a aluminum siding salesman from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Central PA calling. I don't know, but I could never get him to answer the phone. So I've never been out there. Interesting. This is a shot of Monmouth, Illinois. Monmouth College is there. Josiah was a student at the college when war broke out in 1861. And in the West, just like in the North, in 1861, Fort Sumter's fired on, begins the Civil War, although clearly the fuse had been lit many years before that, over slavery, let's be honest. And so what happened in the early days of the war in April of 1861, you had men flocking to join these companies because Lincoln called for men to join to put down the insurrection. Here in Monmouth, there were 100 men who came, and they assembled one night in April in this building right here, which was the Monmouth County Courthouse. They put up a new one. The old one's gone. And how Josiah got into the war is actually really the opening part of the book. They had about 80 men. Now, a company would take 100 men during the Civil War. So let's walk through all of this for those of you not familiar with organization of armies. The smallest unit is going to be a company. It's 100 men. You put together 10 companies to make 1,000 men, that's a regiment. So the 100 men who enlisted from Monmouth were sent to Peoria, put together with other men from Illinois to make 1,000 men as a regiment. That's a full-sized regiment at the beginning of the war. 2 years later, for example, at Gettysburg, just to give you an example, the average size of a regiment at Gettysburg was about 325 to 350 men. That's what happened to those men over a 2-year period. It happened both east and west if you were campaigning. So you would take about 3 or 4 of these regiments, put them together for a brigade. You take together about 3 brigades, they'd form a division. Put together 2, 3 divisions, they'd form an Army Corps, and you put together 1 to however many corps at Gettysburg. Meade had 7 Army Corps to Lee's 3. Lee's corps were bigger, but that gives you what that looked at. But the basic component was a company. So in April of 1861, these men came here to this little courthouse, side by side, literally brother with brother. When you enlisted in the Civil War, unlike today when you enlist and you go in, you might be with somebody from Florida or California or Maine, etc. When you enlisted in the Civil War, you went in, your father might be the captain of the company or one of the sergeants. Your brother would be next to you. Your coworker would be here. If you were a student, your fellow students were with you, just as was the case with Josiah. So 80 men at the beginning of the meeting. During the meeting, they got up to 99. The man who was running it stood up and said, "We need just 1 man more." Well, it was a perfect example where Josiah Moore stood up and said, "I am that 1 man more." Given his little pronouncement, his little theatrics, and the fact, I think, that he stood 6'4" in 1861 caused him to be made the captain of the unit. So he became captain of the 17th Illinois. No military experience whatsoever, which was extremely common during the time. And yes, they did elect their officers back then. After that, they went here to Claycomb Hall, which is still there, out in Monmouth, and I did stop there. This is a little example. This is one of the pictures that I acquired with the collection, just to show you that when you hear blue versus gray, Union in blue, Confederates in gray, this is a gray, what's called a frock coat or a dress coat with dark blue trousers. This is a Union man. So also leads to show you why at the beginning of the war, at certain battles, they'd confuse each other. Even as late as 1862 at Antietam, the Confederates were wearing blue jackets and snuck in on the Union. But made for this old blue versus gray, not always the case. This is a guy named Robert Duncan. He was a sergeant of Josiah's company. He recorded virtually a day-to-day diary of his operation. So when I did my research and put the book together, I relied a lot on what Duncan would say and pull a lot of that about where they were, his comments on some of the casualties and some of the things that this organization had to go through. Duncan was wounded at the Battle of Shiloh, slightly wounded in the hand. What was more interesting about Duncan was I followed through to the end of their lives all the major characters of the book. Duncan's literally reads like a soap opera. It's absolutely incredible because what you can still find in the archives in Washington is incredible. So through his pension records, it was just one heck of a story. This is a guy named Captain Abraham. Well, here he was Colonel Abram Ryan, and he was a lieutenant in one of the other companies in 17th Illinois, not Josiah's company. He was taken as a colonel of the 3rd Arkansas Cavalry in 1865, commanding black troops. They're called USCTs, U.S. Colored Troops. A lot of the white officers, because blacks were not allowed, with few exceptions, not allowed to officer their own men, even though they were enlisted, began to be allowed into the Army in 1863. This is a picture of him in 1865 in a fairly fancy uniform, obviously custom fit. I have some evidence in some of the letters that shows that Abraham Ryan was probably a suitor to Jenny, or at least he envisioned that he was. And I also think that he was the one that introduced them. In 1861, it was considered rude to walk up, if you're a man, to walk up to a female and say, "Hi, my name is," if you found a female you thought was attractive. You had to find someone who knew that female, and that person had to agree to introduce you to her. Otherwise, you were clearly this thug and ruffian, so you couldn't do that. And some evidence in the letters is that I think Ryan might have been the one, and in some other letters, Jenny will write to Josiah and say things like, "Abraham Ryan came by the house the other day. How come you can't get home from the Army?" So it was always these fun little digs in the letters, and sometimes that 19, 20-year-old certainly does come out in the letters. This is a picture that I love. This is well, before I do that, let me just kind of go back for a minute to focus on that. So they got sent to Peoria, before I jump into that picture, sent to Peoria. What was Peoria in Illinois like at the beginning of the war? Because this was one of the crucial things that I found. We all make the assumption, one of the assumptions I think everybody has is that it's north versus south, the lines are clear, and of course we all know, many of us who've looked at it, that you had some of these border states, a state like a Maryland or a Missouri that still had slavery but stayed in the Union. But that other than that, we are really united, and nothing could be further from the truth. Even here, at the beginning of the war, one of Pennsylvania's Supreme Court justices said he advocated drawing the Mason-Dixon line between the Pennsylvania line and the New York state line because he favored the South. The mayor of New York City advocated having the city stay neutral because, well, you know, we do business with both sides. Certain things don't change over time. So, about an hour's north of here, up in Columbia County even, there was a place called the Fishing Creek Confederacy, which I found out about, where deserters and other Southern Confederate sympathizers went. They sent the army in to clean them out in about 1863. Union Army captain was killed. They sent in more. A whole bunch of them wound up going to Fort Mifflin, a prison fort in Philadelphia. So what was Illinois like? And again, a bit surprising. Josiah went to Illinois, and he described kind of what it was like there. And it was not this, we're solidly for the Union. Because northern Illinois, settled by immigrants, felt very differently than southern Illinois people did. Immigrants very, very much against slavery. They viewed that as free labor that competed against their own labors. In the South, you had a lot of people in southern Illinois who had moved into the state from southern states, so were predisposed to having a sympathetic view of the South. In fact, during the war, there were even times when a couple of them advocated, we ought to take some of these counties out of Illinois and secede and go join the Confederacy. So very much different, with Peoria in the middle. So it's kind of this brackish piece where there's some pro and some con. And so that sets up some interesting, it certainly leads to how John Lindsay feels about the war. And so in this climate is when Josiah meets Jenny, not exactly sure how. They agree to communicate. She had to agree to take his letters. He leaves in June of 1861, does not see her for a year and a half. In that year and a half, he goes through Fort Donelson. And in my research, I uncovered a lot of previously unpublished material about Fort Donelson. There's a guy named Frank Peets, who was a captain of one of the other companies as well, who would rise to major and would command the 17th at the Battle of Vicksburg. There's a library in Illinois that has his collection. It has never been utilized, as far as I can tell, for anybody else's research. It was fairly recently given, and some of the material is absolutely incredible that just adds to this complete understanding of it. So this is Abraham Ryan in 1865, actually. This is a picture, so we talked about, Josiah went through Shiloh, he went through Donelson, and of course he went through Vicksburg. Union captured Vicksburg. Anybody know the date when it was captured? July 4th, 1863. Anybody know when the next time that the people of Vicksburg celebrated the 4th of July? July 4th, 1945. Absolutely true. It took the World War I and II to get them back to where they were celebrating it. This is a great picture, and it shows what are called Western troops again. You see these guys, and if you look closely, this is all it says. This is a picture from a book. The original has disappeared from the National Archives. Nobody can find it. I've talked to various other researchers and historians. The picture's gone, but it's in a book that was published probably about 30 or so years ago. You see that unlike in the eastern part, where you see the caps that almost look like baseball caps, these guys have blacker, kind of slouch hats, civilian type hats. This is, by 1864, a very typical looking veteran unit. This is the 17th Illinois. Now, I've looked and looked. I can't tell if Josiah's in there or not. I don't know when this picture was taken. If it's in Vicksburg, on parade ground like this, it's after July 4th, 1863, because they were cannonading each other. They would not have lined up like this before July 4th, 1863. So Josiah may be somewhere in there, although at one point he went home. He was ill for a period, and then he went home on some provost duty. So he may have been gone for that. Came back after that duty on, he arrived back December 25th, 1863. Talk about bad timing. So this is a very typical looking unit of the time. This is the picture of, and I'm going to try and go quickly here because I do want to take your questions. It's this picture of John Lindsay, the famous John Lindsay who made the comment about Lincoln. This is probably 1880s. This is well after the Civil War. After the war, Lindsay tempered his comments a bit because he wanted to stay on the side of the folks who won. So he wanted to be a little careful with his comments about Lincoln. At some point after the war, he lost his hearing, could not work as a lawyer, moved to Nebraska with his one son, who was also a Union Army veteran. His son was a Democrat as well. This is a picture of Josiah at the end of his service. He served 3 years. He did not stay to the end of the war. And what was happening, these guys enlisted for 3 years in 1861. And so what happened after 3 years, it's the spring of '64, it's the beginning of campaign season, East and West. I don't mean political campaign season, East and West. And so what's happening? Government's starting to panic. They're losing their most veteran, their best soldiers who are going to go home because they've served their 3 years. So they had all kinds of enticements. They would say, oh, we'll give you a bounty to stay. We'll send you home on furlough. If enough of your guys from your unit stay, we'll make you a veteran unit to have this designation of esprit de corps. And there was another reference I read in some of my research where a soldier wrote, when he was being wooed to stay for another term, he said, lager beer has lost its persuasive power over me. So you kind of have to love that comment and realize what they were doing. This is Josiah 1864. According to the family, got it from, this was taken on his honeymoon in Minnesota. There's a little close-up of him. Compare those two pictures. Guy on the right, 1861. Guy on the left, haggard, worn. He had been through a lot. He and his men outside 40 to 45 days without cover during the Vicksburg campaign, and he had seen hell. Josiah had seen hell. This is an interesting picture, and let me finish up quickly with these. These guys were obviously proud of their service, as all veterans deserve to be. And this is one of the reunions that they regularly did in Peoria, 1887. The park is still there where they were, and a lot of folks say, why is there a woman sitting in the front? Well, that woman is Belle Reynolds. She was known as the Lady Major in one of Josiah's letters. He referenced the fact that, quote, the Lady Major is back in camp with us. I said, Lady Major, when the heck did this happen? So I did some research on Belle Reynolds, and by the way, so you know, Josiah is sitting in the back there, and these are other men from the 17th, different companies, not only his company. The story of Belle Reynolds was she went off to war with her husband, Lieutenant William Reynolds, Company A, 17th Illinois, which was not uncommon. Many women would go off for their men, at least at the beginning particularly, and stay with them, particularly officers. So at the Battle of Shiloh, when Grant was surprised on day one, April 6th and 7th, April 6th did not go well for the Union. They were not prepared. They had green troops in the front line under Generals Sherman and Prentiss. They were pushed back, overwhelmed, pushed all the way back to the river under cover of the Federal gunboats. Well, the story went that Belle Reynolds, who was there, helped to steady the men, helped to treat the wounded, etc. So the governor of Illinois came down a week or two after the battle, and someone said, you have to go meet this Belle Reynolds. She was wonderful during the battle. She was tremendous. So he met Belle Reynolds, and he said, well, what caused you to be here? She said, I'm here with my husband. Well, who was your husband? His name is William Reynolds of the 17th Illinois. Oh, what rank is your husband? She said, he's a lieutenant. He said, well, I believe in making the better of the woman. You are now a major. So that's how Belle Reynolds became a major in the Union Army. This is a picture of the family shortly thereafter. This is about 1890 or so. Josiah passed away in 1897. Jenny lived for about another 30 years. And they are not buried together. And it's one of those mysteries that nobody quite knows. Let me close with this and turn it over for questions. A couple of things that I found, I told you before, there's some things that I'm surprised by or kind of illuminated certain things for me. One of them was I got to thinking about the guys who came home in 1864 after having fought for 3 years and not seeing the end of the war. And there were no parades, there were no huge parties because men were still dying by the thousands, and Grant's campaign in Virginia and still dying down in Georgia with Sherman going down, and even in the far west. So there wasn't a lot of celebration for these guys, despite the fact that they went through some very horrific battles, and that was some of the men who went home. And they went home with, in their view, a clear conscience. I did my 3 years, and some of them talked about it. I've done my 3 years. Let some of the Sunshine Patriots come down now and come out and and fight this war. So I thought about that, how those men thought at the end of the war in 1865 when this massive parade went down the middle of Washington. Washington. Day 1 was the Army of the Potomac, which was actually still General Meade's army, but Grant went down with them, the Eastern armies. Day 2 was Sherman's army. And the reason they had to do day 2 wasn't not necessarily because they were so large. They hated each other. They couldn't put them in the same area. They had fistfights between the Eastern and Western Union armies. So I thought about those guys, how they thought about that, and he didn't comment too much on that. And the final one, the one I'll close with, is I was amazed by the parallels that I found in my research with Civil War in Vietnam, believe it or not. The end of the war, I think we make the assumptions these guys came home and everything was wonderful and the world was great and they went back to doing what they were doing. And for many of these men, it was far from the truth. For many of these men were not hired. There were employers who said, I'm not going to hire you. You killed people. I don't want you back in my business, and refused to hire them. In fact, one veteran said to his comrades, frankly, boys, the people are afraid of us. And we've done a much better job these days of identifying issues of PTSD, but what we now recognize as PTSD was rampant in those soldiers. And if you think about how I described how a company was put together, it's bad enough when you go in and somebody you've served with for a year and a half is killed beside you, but when you see your brother or your father or a close family member killed in most horrific manners next to you, you can only imagine what that does to the psyche of any human being. So these guys had real struggles, and for many years struggled afterwards with that too. So I'm tremendously appreciative of the fact that we're doing at least something more to provide for today's veterans, recognizing what we did not do for the veterans of 150, 155 years ago.